In 1809, Richard Gough donated a spectacular map to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, a depiction of Great Britain sometime between 1355 and 1366. Although perhaps a little crude and inaccurate by today's standards, this map is incredible, preserving hundreds of place names and towns and rivers and something else. You see, the people from one region in particular were especially astounded by this map, as off the coast of Ceredigion in Wales, there were two fairly large, featureless blobs. There were islands. Well, you'd think that's nothing unusual, right? There's a couple of other unlabeled islands on this map. But that's not the problem. You see, there are no islands in this part of Ceredigion Bay. These islands today do not exist. And while the discovery of two now lost landmasses is interesting, some people became even more curious, because there exists a story, a local legend, of two kingdoms that once ruled lands off the coast of Ceredigion, one on an island and one on a large flat plain, both of which were destroyed by the encroaching ocean. Two long-lost landmasses, now accompanied by two long-lost islands. I would tell you that this is the story of the myth of a land that fell beneath the waves, but really this is the story of what was supposed to be the myth of the medieval kingdom that sank into the ocean. Before we get started, I want to quickly talk about the sponsor that makes this video possible, Babbel. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, with intuitive lessons that help you learn through actual real-life conversations, rather than just reciting words like I had to do in school. Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers to prepare you for actual, practical conversations, and are a great method to improve your skills, whether that's just for travel, friends, family, business, or just to improve your own self. I've started learning their Spanish course, not only because learning through real-world conversations is so much better, but also because I'm from the UK, which means I have to infest the shores of Spain at least once every few years. And what I've personally found is that even just attempting to use words and phrases in someone's native language can make a massive difference. Babbel also offers a 20-day money-back guarantee, which means you can try it and have no worries if you don't like it. Plus, they offer a multitude of different subscriptions to suit you best, and you get 2 free live classes. Click the link in the description and the pinned comment and get 60% off of your subscription today. Give Babbel a try and see just how far 15 minutes of learning a language can take you. That's the link down in the description box or in the pinned comment. Thank you. The oldest physical copy of this story can be found in a book known as the Llyfr du Caerfyrddin, the Black Book of Carmarthen, which dates to around 1225 at the earliest, which is almost as old as you. In here we find a poem. It's fairly short and there's no title, but it goes something like this. Our narrator cries out to a man named Cythenin and tells him to behold a disaster that has just unfolded before him. The sea has been raging and billowing, and now it's overflowed over the ramparts and completely flooded an area of land known as Maes Gwyddno. The narrator curses a maiden named Mererid, who we're told released the sea after a feast with some strong wines. They then lament and despair for a few verses until we're told that Cythenin, the weak or feeble-minded, has died and been buried near the shore. That's not a lot to go off of, but it does tell us a few things. Firstly, according to the story, somewhere on the coast there used to be a plain of land known as Maes Gwyddno. It was apparently being protected from the encroaching sea by some ramparts, and by a woman named Mererid, who was given the title of Ffynnon Menester Môr Terwyn, the fountain cupbearer of the powerful sea. Not something you typically find on a CV, and that makes this line stand out a lot, especially because, apparently after some strong wines, she let the ocean flood Maes Gwyddno, suggesting that it was actively her job to keep the water at bay. We're also introduced to a man named Cythenin, but all he does is look at the ocean. And finally, we're introduced to someone named Gwyddno. In this poem, that's just the name of this plain, but in another poem within the same book, he's revealed to be a person. In this poem, a king named Gwyn ap Nudd is boasting to someone about all of his accomplishments, claiming to be an unparalleled warrior. The man he is boasting to is described as having his shield in distress, suggesting that Gwyn has just bested him in combat, and in his defeat, the man reveals his name to be Gwyddno Garanhir, which means Longshanks. Now, Gwyddno is not a unique name. We're aware of about 6 other various kings or fathers of saints in Welsh history with the same name, But what our Gwyddno Garanhir has going for him is that he's here. He's the only Gwyddno present in this collection of poems, one of which recounts a story of a land bearing his name that was flooded by the ocean. This connection was not lost on the Welsh poets over the next few centuries. Gwtor Glyn writes about how God commanded the ocean to destroy Gwyddno Garanhir's lands, but the poet Lewis Morris just blames it on the waves instead. It's even referenced in an elegy from the 1500s as Lewis Morgannwg, for some reason, reminds the funeral goers about how Gwyddno Garanhir's castle was sunk beneath the waves. Lewis's lack of situational awareness, along with the other two poets, tell us that this story was fairly notable. People were expected to know and understand what they were talking about. But there's not much to this story, is there? We're told who Mererid is, but Saithennin and even Gwyddno, the man who gave his name to this land, are completely unknown. And how does this even tie into our islands in Ceredigion Bay? We don't even have a location for this story. Luckily for us, we do have more clues, because while the Black Book of Carmarthen may preserve the oldest physical version of this story, there exists a text that seems to contain some much more ancient elements. We can find these in a book known as Hanes Taliesin. The oldest manuscript we have is from 1552, and it tells a semi-prophetic story about a bard named, well, Taliesin. But the parts that are most relevant to us are near the very beginning. When Taliesin was born, he was said to have been cast down a river in a basket, until landing at a weir named Cantre'r Gwaelod. Here, a man named Elfyn finds him and takes him back to his father, Gwyddno Garanhir, confirming to the readers and to us now that this is indeed our Gwyddno whose lands sunk into the ocean. Hanes Taliesin makes no mention of this flooding though, implying perhaps that it had already taken place, maybe even implying that our plain, Maes Gwyddno, had been flooded and all that remained was a weir, Cantre'r Gwaelod. Taliesin himself was from the 6th century. He's associated with two kings from around this time, Cynan of Powys and Maelgwn of Gwynedd. In addition, his surviving poetry is entirely written in Old Welsh, dated by the historian Ivor Williams to either the 6th or 7th centuries, placing Gwyddno and his mysterious flooded lands at around the same date. You may be thinking that this doesn't matter at all though. This manuscript is much newer than the Black Book of Carmarthen, right? So what does this have to do with our story? Well, while this physical version of Hanes Taliesin was written in the 1500s, the story itself appears to be much older. Elements from this book are referenced in Taliesin's 6th to 7th century poetry, and the story itself is filled with strange and fascinating pre-Christian elements, such as reincarnation, spells, human-to-animal transformations, being born under evil hours, and so on. What this tells us then is that potentially the story of Gwyddno Garanhir and his sunken lands are from as early as the 6th or 7th centuries, which would explain Gwyddno's sudden, unexplained appearance in the Black Book of Carmarthen. Our story is now a little more fleshed out, and we can cautiously pinpoint its origins to around the 6th century AD, or at the very least sometime before 1225. We still have a couple of questions though. Who is Saithennin? Where exactly is this plain and weir of Gwyddno? And what does this have to do with those mysterious islands from 1355? Well, one of those answers is actually given to us in this very manuscript. But if you're already familiar with this story, I promise it's not going to be what you expect. This 1552 document squarely places the Weir of Gwyddno, these lost lands, right here, at the mouth of the River Conwy in North Wales. So, is this mysterious flooded plain located over here? Well, in another document, this time from 1610, Cantre'r Gwaelod was placed somewhere else entirely, instead putting it between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi in West Wales. But surely we can trust the older manuscript more, right? Well, no, because in another document, Leyland's itinerary from around 1536, he mentions the story of lands cleanly devoured by the sea, being located between Aberdyfi and Tywyn in Meirionydd. So to recap, in 1536 we have our flooded plain in the west, but in 1552 it's moved to the north, only to be taken back to Ceredigion in 1610. This weir cannot have been in more than one location, unless we're to think that it snaked around half of the Welsh coast, so presumably one of these manuscripts are right. And it wouldn't be all that uncommon for copies of a story to pick up a few corrections and embellishments over the course of 1,000 years, and in fact we are already aware of one, Gwyddno's son Elphin is a known mistake. This name comes from the north of Britain, specifically from a manuscript documenting the ancestry of some Brythonic kings in the north, which tells us of a man named Gwyddno ap Cawdraf, and gives him a son, Elphin, the Welsh form of Alpin. Hanes Taliesin seems to have been aware of this and corrected the name of Gwyddno's son in the story to match this man of the north, despite the fact that he is never associated with Wales at all. And to add to the confusion, later versions, now seemingly aware of the story in Hanes Taliesin, then add the epithet Garin here to this man of the north, and say that he owned Cantre'r Gwaelod, teleporting him from the north of Britain to somewhere in Wales, in a document explicitly about the north of Britain. So if a passing similarity can jumble up a story so easily, then is it possible that the same thing happened to the location of Cantre'r Gwaelod? Is there a similar story that the writer of Hanes Taliesin could have mistakenly corrected his document to match in either Conwy or Ceredigion? And can we use this to figure out where this story is supposed to be? Yes, in fact, there are a few, because Maes Gwyddno is not the only story of a kingdom lost beneath the waves. In a triad, a short snippet of traditional Welsh poetry, myth or legend, preserved only in a single random manuscript from 1280 in Exeter, we encounter our other three Sunken Kingdoms. These are the kingdoms which the sea destroyed. The kingdom of Teithi Hen, called Ceredigion or Ynys Teithi Hen, which could be found between St. David's and Ireland. No men or beasts escaped from the sea here, except for Teithi Hen alone. The second was the kingdom of Helig ap Glanog, which was between Ceredigion, Ynys Enlli and St. David's. The land was called Maes Meigen, and was found between the Mouth, Cantre'r Hen and Aberdyfi. The third was the kingdom of Redvoy ap Reged. This manuscript has opened a lot of doors to us, so let's explore them, starting from the bottom. Redvoy here is a bit of a letdown. Nothing is told to us about him except that he has an association with Reged, a Brythonic kingdom around modern-day Cumbria in England, which would place him in the north, but sadly that's where we're going to have to leave him for now. Teithi Hen from the First Kingdom is a rare figure found in only a single piece of Welsh mythology, a story known as Culhwch ac Olwen, where we find him in the court of King Arthur. He tells us, just like the Triad, that his kingdom was overrun by the ocean, leaving him as the only survivor, although nothing else really happens to him. What's really interesting about Teithi though, is that his kingdom was an island, Ynys Teithi Hen. Do you remember at the start of this video when I said two legends of Sunken Kingdoms exist, one on an island and one on a plain? Well, this is that island, and it's referenced in another place outside of this triad. In the Book of Llandav, another medieval Welsh text, a saint known as Odosius is once said to have overseen a diocese stretching from Mocas near Hereford to as far as Ynys Teithi. However, a king in South Wales named Cadogan apparently expelled his clergy from everywhere west of the Towey, shrinking his diocese and, if Ynys Teithi was supposedly the furthest point from Hereford, placing our mysterious island somewhere west of the Towey. Of course, the Triad claims that it was between St. David's in Ireland, but there's no geological evidence for what would have to be a 100 to 120 metre volcano just below the surface. What there is evidence for, though, are two missing islands in Ceredigion Bay. Let's quickly have a look at that second kingdom belonging to Helig, because as you may have already noticed, it's located in around the same place that the 1610 copy of Hanes Taliesin claimed that Cantre'r Gwaelod was located, with Helig's lands being placed right in Ceredigion Bay between the Mouth, Cantre'r Hen and Aberdyfi. The Mouth is likely a river mouth or aber in Welsh and could technically be anywhere, but one version of Hanes Taliesin names the town of Aberystwyth alongside Aberdyfi as being the location of Cantre'r Gwaelod. Cantre'r Hen though is much harder to locate. The historian Peter Bartram cautiously suggested that it could be the Llyn Peninsula. Cantre'r Hen and Llyn are a little similar, although I think it bears a bit more resemblance to Teithi Hen, potentially as a reference to Ynys Teithi Hen. So if we look back to our mysterious islands on this map of Britain, we can spot something exciting. This more northern island is located precisely between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi, just like the 1610 manuscript of Hanes Taliesin said. And if this southern island is supposed to be the remnants of Ynys Teithi Hen, then this land is located exactly where the Triad said it was, between Aberdyfi, Teithi Hen or Teithi Hen, and an Aber, likely Aberystwyth. Therefore, as I said at the start of this video, we do appear to have actual physical locations attached to these mythical lands of Teithi Hen and Maes Gwyddno, two islands off the coast of Ceredigion that disappeared at least by the 1600s. The problem though is that this isn't named as the location of the famous Maes Gwyddno, the land that had been referenced in poetry from potentially the 6th century. It's named as somewhere else entirely, the Kingdom of Helig ap Glanog and Maes Meigen. Furthermore, why do some texts associate Maes Gwyddno with the north and Conwy? How can this island be attached to any legend if the location cannot even be agreed upon? The answer comes from the question I asked at the start of the last chapter. Is there a similar story to that of Maes Gwyddno that the writer of Ynys Taliesin could have mistakenly corrected his story to match? And as we've seen, yes, there are at least 3 other tales of Sunken Kingdoms, and one of these is practically identical in terms of location to the Weir of Gwyddno described in Ynys Taliesin, and to the tales of sunken lands described in Leyland's itinerary. So is it possible that over the centuries, details between the kingdoms of Gwyddno and Helig could have become confused with one another? Yes, but is it possible that there were just 2 sunken lands in the Bay of Ceredigion? Also yes, but that would leave the question as to why that 1552 text of Ynys Taliesin would so concretely place the Weir of Gwyddno at the mouth of the River Conwy. He must have made a mistake, just like how he adopted a different Gwyddno son into the story, right? But a mistake from where? Well, the answer may lie between King Helig's full name, Helig ap Glanog. This just means that he's the son of someone named Glanog, but the problem here is that, as far as I'm aware, we don't know anyone named Glanog within this period of Welsh history. But what we are aware of is a place known as Glanog. In English it was known as Priestholm or Puffin Island today on the account of all the puffins and the noticeable lack of priests, but in Welsh it was known as Ynys Glanog, becoming Ynys Seiriol in the 1500s. This name, Ynys Glanog, is also really old. It's first seen in a document known as the Annals Cambria, where in 629 AD, King Cadwallon is recorded as being besieged on the island of Glanauc, a Latin spelling that was reproduced identically in that Exeter Triad, where the kingdom of Helig ap Glanauc is mentioned as being lost beneath the waves. Also near Ynys Glanog is a stretch of sand known as Traeth Helig, and while the specific location of this beach is now lost, a 15th century text pinpoints it to somewhere near the Lord of Penrhyn in Gwynedd, North Wales, and near Ynys Glanog. So while some surviving texts associate Helig and Gwyddno with the same legend of a sunken kingdom in Ceredigion Bay, Helig's name is heavily associated with this region of North Wales, potentially from as early as the 7th century. Something that also places Helig within North Wales are the 16th century genealogical manuscripts. They were drawn up by the wealthy to demonstrate their ancient, typically royal ancestries. And while they're for the most part quite jumbled and messy, they do frequently contain some useful information. But for today they demonstrate something that's usually not talked about with medieval sources. They demonstrate what the people of the time believed to be true. Namely, while Ynys Taliesin named Gwyddno as the king of a sunken kingdom in North Wales, and while a triad 200 years prior placed Helig as the ruler of lands lost to the sea in West Wales. The gentry, the people who would be familiar with the story, who those poets and bards would perform to, recounting the details of these lost kingdoms, believed Helig to be the ancestor of the wealthy men of Arllechwedd and Gwynedd Ys Conwy, both in North Wales. Whilst Gwyddno was claimed as an ancestor of the gentry of Arllechwedd again, but mainly of Llyn, Eifionnydd, Meirionnydd, Ceredigion, and a cantref or county that those of you who are familiar with the story have likely been waiting to hear the entire time. Cantre'r Gwaelod, the Sunken or Bottom County, a name that appears to originate with these 16th century genealogies. So in the 15th century, while some surviving texts are placing Helig in the west and Gwyddno in the north, the gentry, the rich and powerful, the men with the time and the money to read and write and listen to poetry, and whose reputations banked on claiming ancestry to famous and powerful figures, claimed that Helig was from North Wales and that Gwyddno was from around Ceredigion Bay. Over the next few centuries, these legends of sunken kingdoms would grow, but it seems that the similarities that led to Helig and Gwyddno's tales to be confused for one another would eventually lead to the demise of Helig ap Glanog's story altogether, as our Cantre'r Gwaelod captured the imaginations of the poets and writers over the next few centuries instead. While our Gwyddno Garanhir and his sunken county, spelled Cantre'r Gwaelod today, would form a local legend famous in Wales even up to now, the last time Helig would get any sort of notable mention was in 1625. Here we're told that Helig's lands, again now mistakenly called Cantre'r Gwaelod rather than the older Maes Meigen, lay between Bangor and Pen-y-Gough in North Wales, with the ruins of Helig's palace apparently being visible out in Conwy Bay at very low tides. And in fact, in an 18th century sea chart of Wales, which the National Library of Wales very kindly gave me permission to use, we can see these ruins, or rather what these ruins really are. A collection of rocks located just below the surface, known as Caer Conwy. What's really interesting though, is that right next to it is a weir, Ceredigion Valgun, named after the 6th century king of this area, and is found right in the place that Ynys Taliesin claimed that Cantre'r Gwaelod could be found. It seems that we may have discovered the source for all of that confusion in the 1500s. There are 2 Sunken Kingdoms and 2 weirs, one in the north, Ceredigion Valgun, and one in the west, Cantre'r Gwaelod, although we don't yet know where Cantre'r Gwaelod is. So despite centuries of confusions and mixings and corrections and embellishments, it really seems like Helig is associated with Ynys Gwyddno, Llys Helig, Caer Conwy, and Ceredigion Valgun, all in North Wales, while Gwyddno Garanhir is associated with the lands off the coast of Aberystwyth, Aberdyfi, Ynys Teithi Hen, and wherever Cantre'r Gwaelod is, finally leading us back to those 2 missing islands. We can now much more concretely say that the story of Cantre'r Gwaelod and Maes Gwyddno is associated with this area of coast, between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi, and with these 2 mysterious islands. We've seen the evolution of what people thought for centuries was just a myth. We've seen how it's been confused and corrected and rewritten, but now we have to ask one final question. Why are there missing landmasses exactly where a story about missing landmasses takes place? Since the 1990s, a number of historians have proposed that these stories may be more than stories, that the tale of Cantre'r Gwaelod may have a basis in history. More specifically, Matthews, Davis, Nunn, Kavanagh, and Bates have all separately proposed over the last 30 years that this myth is rooted in a folk memory, that is, a piece of history passed down orally for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And what folk memory are they suggesting that these flooded kingdoms are based on? The melting of the glaciers, and the rising of the sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. This sounds very reasonable. The western side of Great Britain in the Irish Sea has a lot of very shallow water. The whole of Ceredigion Bay only reaches the maximum depth of about 40 metres, and only about 20 metres up to here. The same is true for the coast of North Wales, where Helig ap Glanog's Sunken Kingdom was based. What these historians are proposing then is that the Welsh retained a memory of settlements and kingdoms being gradually destroyed by the encroachment of the ocean over the span of a few thousand years, eventually passing this memory down the centuries until it became adopted as the tale of 3 kingdoms that were lost beneath the waves. Our friend Redvoy ap Reged can also make a return here, as plenty of land around the county of Cumbria is similarly low-lying and was presumably also lost and passed down in memory. There is a problem though. That isn't how the story goes, is it? Teithi Hen didn't slowly lose his island over the course of a few years. It was suddenly and violently ripped away, leaving him as the only survivor. Gwyddno and Saithennan didn't stand around for a century watching their kingdom slowly overflow. They witnessed it be destroyed in a sudden, unexpected event, when the raging sea billowed and overtook their ramparts. We know that this folk memory survived in Wales, it's referenced in the Mabinogion, but again, here it's much more casual. It says that, in those days the deep water between Ireland and Wales was not wide. There were 2 rivers, the Llys and Archan, but afterwards the water grew wider when the deep overflowed the kingdoms. There's a reference to our Sunken Kingdoms here, but these stories were written down in the Middle Ages, and we can't be certain if they were always referenced, or if the person transcribing the text just decided to include these famous tales. But regardless, the glaciers did not melt and flood the coast of Britain all at once. So even if the stories of Gwyddno and Helig and Teithi Hen have roots in these ancient memories, there must be another source of inspiration. Haslet and Willis, in a paper on these islands, note that it's possible that the story of Gwyddno Garan here was describing a major storm, or even a tsunami. The sea raging and billowing and rising up and over the walls of the kingdom certainly sounds like a tidal wave, and there are other legends about these waves in Wales too. A medieval text known as the Historia Brittonum mentions a story of the ocean receding near the River Severn here and throwing up a mountainous wave, which covered the shore of South Wales. This is a perfect description of a tsunami that must have occurred sometime before the 9th century when this text was written, so is it unreasonable to think that perhaps some very hostile waves struck the coast of Wales before the time of Taliesin in the 6th century, when the legend of Maes Gwyddno may have already existed? An earthquake somewhere in or near the Irish Sea could theoretically cause large waves to attack the western coast of Wales and a tsunami to run up the Severn Sea, but we can't be certain about that at all. As Haslet and Willis say, it's a question that requires further investigation. The final place we can look for clues on the origins and merit of these stories are on the islands themselves. We know that they disappeared by at least the 1600s, but they don't actually appear on a single other map apart from the Gough map in 1355. So what does this mean? Firstly, you may have said that they were just a mistake, and that's of course possible but very unlikely. You see, unlike with the poorly drawn Scotland, English cartographers had full, unrestricted access to Wales at this time. They weren't just guessing coastlines. What this means then is that these islands likely existed, but that they were fairly small and low-lying, allowing them to be eroded by the 1600s. But of course, if we had land masses here that disappeared below the waves, you'd expect to still be able to find evidence of them, right? And we can, because while the islands only appear on one map, we can find their remains on two. Greenwood's 1834 map of Wales includes something very interesting. A long, thin line stretching from just north of Aberystwyth out into the sea, ending at a small, unlabelled patch of something below the waves. And what this something is actually answered for us on an earlier map. Do you remember that coastal chart of Wales that marked the supposed location of Helig's palace under the waves? Well, on that same chart, extending out to the sea from Aberystwyth, we find Sunken Kingdoms, ending at an outcrop of rocks which we're told are visible during the low tides of spring. And what are these rocks called? Cantre'r Gwaelod, the name of the man whose story we've been chasing for over 1,000 years. These Sarnau that Cantre'r Gwaelod is located on are long deposits of rocks left over from the Ice Age and extending far out into the sea. We have the one I already mentioned, Sunken Kingdoms, the much shorter Sarnau north of Aberdyfi, and the colossal Sarn Badrig near Harlech, which extends for over 12 miles. These rocky paths are huge and prominent and visible during low spring tides, and don't they look remarkably like walls? Is it possible that the stories of Maes Gwyddno and Ynys Teithi Hen were based in a historic memory of the ocean swallowing up the lands in Ceredigion Bay? Perhaps further dramatised by the memory of a tidal wave or a huge storm by the 6th century? Sure. We know that these memories survived in other places. Why couldn't they be adapted further? There are remains of ancient forests here also that become visible in very low tides. These could have easily inspired or amplified the memory of a lost plain of dry land. Perhaps also there were settlements on these islands. Ynys Teithi Hen was supposed to be the furthest part of a diocese, so were there people to preach to on here? Cantre'r Gwaelod is also noted as a famous location to catch fish in Ynys Taliesin, so there may have been a small community on Cantre'r Gwaelod until the island became too small and eroded to live on. But this story of the sunken Cantre'r, the kingdom at the bottom of Ceredigion Bay, protected by ramparts until a drunken Mererid accidentally let loose a surging ocean over these walls, could these have been inspired by the Sarnau, the huge rocky barriers extending for miles out into the ocean? It's certainly possible. And in any case, these Sarnau are almost certainly where these two mysterious islands were located. We already have Cantre'r Gwaelod presumably attached to Cantre'r Gwaelod or Sunken Kingdoms, but it seems like the Gough map has actually placed them slightly too far south, meaning that I'll have to take back something I suggested earlier, and place the hypothetical location of Ynys Teithi Hen on this northern island instead, leaving Cantre'r Gwaelod in between Aberystwyth, Aberdyfi and Teithi Hen, possibly Teithi Hen. One final point I want to bring up before we finish the video are the names we started this entire video with, Gwyddno and Saith Hennin. Gwyddno has a story to him, but this seems to have developed later. And Saithennin ultimately was actually given Mererid's story. She was written out, but originally he starts with nothing. So who are they? One suggestion for Saithennin is that he may be a very corrupt form of Teithi Hen. Getting rid of the S makes the names look extremely similar, but they would be pronounced quite differently. And then we have to ask how an S even got added in the first place. Gwyddno, though, is interesting. Unlike his counterpart Helig ap Glanog or Redvoy Reged, he doesn't have any geographical connections. Although, as I mentioned at the very start of this video, there are other people named Gwyddno. This name is associated with two places, Hen Ogledd, the Brythonic-speaking north, and Ceredigion Bay. Two saints in this area have fathers named Gwyddno. Two kings in the north are named Gwyddno, and finally one king in Meirionnydd is also named Gwyddno. I bring this up because Hanes Taliesin claims that King Gwyddno ruled lands near Corrad Wyddno, or Sunken Kingdoms, and King Gwyddno of Meirionnydd both had a son Idris, who died around 632, and ruled Meirionnydd, placing him both near Corrad Wyddno and at around the time of the bard Taliesin. Of course, this story is, as we've seen, severely jumbled and confused. I think it's just worth pointing out that there is at least one historical Gwyddno who could have inspired the name of the king, or the weir. With all that complete, let's finally summarise what we've seen and recount what was just supposed to be the myth of the missing islands and the kingdoms that were lost beneath the waves. Several thousand years ago, the ocean was much shallower. The crossing between Wales and Ireland was narrower, and the lands that are now the coastal waters of Ceredigion Bay were covered in forests and long, snaking glacial deposits. As the temperatures rose and the ice began to melt, these lands were gradually lost to the waves, a memory that must have been impactful to the people of Great Britain, as thousands of years later, stories were still recalled of a time where the waters of the Irish Sea were much less deep. What these rising oceans left behind in Wales, though, were a series of ridges or Sarnau, two now missing islands on the ends of them, and a trio of stories, three kingdoms whose lands were supposedly lost beneath the waves. But the idea that these myths were based on a memory of the ocean gradually rising is debated, because two of them tell a much more sudden and violent tale of a raging sea leaving all but one survivor. These billowing waves may have instead been inspired by a tsunami that struck the coast of South Wales sometime before the 9th century, and as our story of Maes Gwyddno may originate in the 6th, this tidal wave may have appeared much earlier. The memory of a land lost to the sea, coupled with the striking imagery of the submerged, petrified forest near Ynys Las in Western Wales, was no doubt inspiring. Pair this with two small islands that may have had their own communities who were vulnerable to storms and waves, and the genesis of a myth appears. But the tale of Maes Gwyddno and Cantre'r Gwaelod may be based in history, as the island and weir bearing Gwyddno's name did actually exist. And while the colossal Sarnau stretching for miles out into the ocean may have inspired a story of a drunken Mererid accidentally flooding the ramparts of an entire kingdom, a very real storm or tidal wave may have posed a genuine threat to anyone living near or on these low-lying islands. And all it takes is the destructive memory of one rogue wave to inspire a story that lasts for millennia. Similarities between the story of Gwyddno's Cantre'r Gwaelod and Helig's Sunken Kingdom would lead to centuries of confusion, with details being crossed and swapped and corrected dozens of times. However, to the people familiar with the story in the 1500s, Gwyddno was categorically from the west of Wales, while Helig was supposed to be from the north, with his ruins seen in the rocks submerged just out in Conwy Bay. In any case, a story that was once thought to be a simple tall tale was forever changed with the discovery that, well, there really were some sunken islands off of the coast of Wales, which makes you wonder if there could be any other kernels of truth within the other stories of the kingdoms lost to sea. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you again to the National Library of Wales for allowing me to use their sea charts, and thanks to Babbel for sponsoring this video. And if you're interested in the histories of lost or missing kingdoms, then you're in luck, because I have 2 more in a playlist for you right here.